Hello. I don't have nearly as many slides as the first person, so you're just going to have to listen to me talk, unfortunately. So my name is Austin, and just a little bit of background about me. I've been a traditional artist since as long as I can remember. I even remember as a child going into kindergarten school and seeing other kids drawing, and I thought that's what the school was. I was very mistaken, obviously. That's not what school is. When I was older, I went to school for a bachelor's degree, trying to get a degree in animation and media arts back in the US. And about 6 months before I was about to graduate, I sort of had a crisis of faith, because I was like, I don't know if I really want to do this. Because you can have talent at something, but not have passion at it. And I really didn't like the industry for animation or games. So my supervisor at the time took me aside and he took me to the studio and put me in VR. And I'd never before been in VR. It was my first time. And he showed me the program that you may or may not be familiar with called The Blue, which is one of the very first little free programs that is available on the Oculus Store. And it's a very simple program. It's only about 5 or 7 minutes long. And you're just underwater, and you're on a shipwreck underwater, and there's manta rays swimming around you, there's fish, and a giant blue whale comes up, swims up to you, and then swims off. That's it. Okay. So, several years later, as Joe mentioned, I am now working on a PhD on VR. So, what the hell happened in between, right? I wasn't going to do anything with this, and then suddenly I'm doing this. So, and really what it comes down to was actually that first experience. Sorry, that first experience really just drastically changed me. And I don't consider myself an easily influenced person. I'm quite stubborn, to be honest. But it changed me so profoundly that I completely changed my career path, because I felt in that moment the power that VR could be that we weren't really tapping into yet. So I got my degree, moved to Hawaii, started studying marine biology, started working with marine mammals, got certified in diving, which is terrifying. There's a lot of sharks in Hawaii, and they're faster than you think that they are. There's even an island that literally breeds hammerhead sharks right near where we lived. Yeah, it's not great. Anyway, but I did all of this because I really wanted to understand where the feeling came from that I got, and I wanted to understand the science behind it, and I wanted to really gather everything scientifically as I could so that I could recreate it in VR, so that I could have other people experience the same thing that I experienced. So, moved to Scotland and started a master's degree in VR, and the journey was born. So, it's obviously a whale. I do love whales. So, I created a VR experience that's not a game. And I was very, very clear that I didn't want it to be a game. You can still interact with things, but it's unguided. There's no narration. There's nothing telling you what to do, no words or anything. It does have a story though, and the story is solely driven by art theory, color theory, shape, light, and movement. Nothing else. It tells an entire story. Because I wanted to see, one, if people could understand the story, if it would affect their mood and emotions, if they would have some sort of a self-reflection afterwards, and ultimately, how just focusing on the art instead of the functionality would actually be able to change people, which is a bit backwards, because in games we generally focus on the functionality first. Even when you prototype things, you're trying to make sure that everything works, obviously, before you put it out into the world, before you focus on the art. But in a storytelling experience, that doesn't really work. And I wanted something that anybody could do. So, like our first presenter was talking about, the issue with controllers, I didn't want people trying to fiddle with controllers the entire time. That breaks your immersion in VR. I wanted them to feel present. Yes, they can still touch things, but in a way where it's simplified. Okay, where they don't have to press buttons, they don't have to teleport places, it's room scale, they can just walk around and observe. So while you can walk around and observe in this, you can also move with the actual whale. So there's several of the scenes where you're actually physically moving, which again is not necessarily something that you're told that you should do in VR. You shouldn't really move the camera because it can induce sickness. But I've actually found it really, really, really effective if done correctly. So like this particular scene is my calm scene. It was the emotion that I was targeting was supposed to be really like calm and relaxed. And you're just floating through the scene with this whale, and there's like, I don't know, like 15 sea turtles that start swimming up beside you like the entire way. So the animation is solely driven by the music, and the movement. And so this story is about a whale. It's a sad story. The beginning, you see like a happy mother and a calf swimming together. Mother gets carted off by a trawling ship, so the calf is now alone, and it's kind of about its perils that it meets along its journey to meet another pod. So like this particular scene, I was sort of targeting a mysterious feel, right? So the music is a little bit creepy, but it's still very, very quite interesting, and everybody likes glowing things. It's a thing, apparently. So I use this as a stepping stone because I wanted to, like I said, see how these things could affect your emotion and your mood, and ultimately it was very effective in that aspect. I'm not going to get too researchy with it because it's not really what this is, but that was my starting point for AONR. So AONR was my pilot project for my PhD. So based on sort of the same aspects of focusing on the art first for storytelling, however, it is a bit deeper. There is narration. I've got a local narrator who's actually narrating the story. It's based on Scottish folklore. So this is my little character, Reed. So, as Joe mentioned, it won a BAFTA award in the immersive category, and which is really great. But really, the question becomes: is why did it do well? There's lots of other people, right, that applied. So why did this particularly do well? So, and there's lots of things about it. So, but I'm only going to focus on 3 things. So the first one is the interactivity. So obviously, we all really love VR because we can touch shit, right? We can just interact with our entire world, which is really, really great. It becomes very problematic when it comes to storytelling, however. So this particular scene is a little garden scene, and I've got all of this lovely little, carrots and whatnot, right? And for my initial run, I made all of these things interactable. And you can probably imagine what happened is that people just start picking up things and just start throwing veg everywhere, right? So they're not really paying attention to my story anymore, are they? They're just, how far can I throw this carrot? It's gonna bounce off of this. So that's why it becomes really problematic. But I still want them to be able to interact with the world, but I need them to be actually engaged in the story. So how can you do that? There's this really, really fine line that you have to sort of, because they don't want to be bored. I don't want to bore you with the story, because then you're just watching, a 360 video, and that's not what this is. So I pulled back the interactivity pretty heavily. And then I took another look at just focusing on the story and the science of storytelling. So if you think about, when an author writes a story, they're not telling you every single detail about every single thing that's happening in the world. Okay, they're very specifically telling you with purpose about very certain things. They're describing them in a certain way. They're telling you at a certain time. And so this sort of creates this concept of meaningful items. And when I talk about meaningful items, it's not, it seems a little bit common sense, right? But it doesn't mean that they have purpose. It means that they're meaningful. And what I mean is that they're not only meaningful in the story, but they're meaningful to the characters in the story, and then they create meaning to the actual user. Okay, and this is the key in creating that meaning. So I changed this. So this particular little item here is like a magic shell. And it's not really fancy. It's just like a little musical instrument. So this story is about a lonely lighthouse keeper, and he sort of has, he has this little life on this little island, but he eventually meets a selkie, which is a sort of a shape-shifting creature that can change from seal into a woman. And then they have like this sort of like little love affair, right? But it starts with this particular item. So at some point he's sitting on the beach and he finds this item. And he uses this item to actually call out to the sea. And it's a very sort of mournful, very poignant sound that he makes with this. And then throughout the rest of the story, there's multiple other times where this particular item comes to play. And it's interactable within the story. And something really interesting happened. So in the beginning, when I first ran it, I had two types of people, right? I had the people that were throwing everything around, like the veg, and then I had people that were touching nothing, right? They're just standing like this. They're just sort of looking around, very unsure about things. But when I started to add items that had meaning, there was a cohesiveness with both of those people. They both gravitated towards it. They both interacted with it. But they interacted it in a way that was very different. They weren't throwing it around. They were picking it up as if it was fragile. As if it was, actually important. So, very subtly, I actually changed their behavior. Just changing a simple thing, right? So I started adding more meaningful items and the things that people gravitate towards. And this is one of the reasons why A&R started to really actually work. So the next thing is presence. We've all heard this term, being present in VR. We're immersed. Presence is just feeling like you're actually there and you're not really aware of the world outside of you. Which again is one of the reasons why I pulled back, a lot of the buttons and stuff, because I wanted people to feel like they were there. But I also, again, really, really wanted to focus on the art, okay? Feeling like you're actually there. So I did a lot of this with color and light and shape. Particularly, light played a really, really large role. So this particular scene, I know it doesn't really encapsulate like actually what it looks like, but during this scene, you're on this little part of the island with these magical stones, and you're watching this sunrise over the ocean, and the rays are hitting you, okay? And because of how you are positioned and how the sun is actually hitting you, it creates this sort of euphoric feeling. So any of us that have seen an actual sunrise, it's the same exact feeling. It's not different. Even though this is very stylized, it's not realistic, that same feeling is being created. So I really, really made sure that every scene had that element, and that it changed depending on the lighting. So this is inside of his little house, and there's certain interactable items in this, but during certain parts of the story, when I wanted to portray a certain mood, I changed the lighting. Again, it seems a little common sense, but it's not really being implemented in a lot of VR things. This scene in particular was really, really interesting. So this is an incredibly simple scene. All that happens is this character here walks past you and goes and he lies down on his bed. But because of how I created it, people had a really interesting reaction. So all of these scenes they had interactions. There were standing rooms so you can move around. But in this particular scene, nobody seemed to want to do anything. Like they didn't really want to move around or touch things. And when I asked them why, I got a lot of answers like they felt like they were going to disturb the character, or they felt it would be impolite to be rifling through his things, and all of these things. This is a made-up, stylized character, but yet they're concerned about appearing rude, right? And so this is really the essence of presence, right? They are actually really immersed in that story at that time. And then we go on to movement. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about moving the camera, which it works really well, honestly. But I didn't want this to be, like I said, a 360 video where you're just observing what's happening. You still need to be involved in the story. However, you don't have the ability to actually change or control it. And it's rather difficult to sort of ride this tertiary line where you are not necessarily a first person, who can actually change things, but you are still involved. So like this particular scene, this is the game view, but you're sitting in this boat with the character, right? And you're actually moving along the sea with him. And so you're seeing what he's seeing. Okay, you're experiencing what he's experiencing. And so by making sure that the user is there right along with the character the entire time, instead of just doing their own thing and instead of just watching them interact with other things, it creates this connectivity to the character, even though this character does not talk to you at all. It doesn't interact with you at all during it. But because you're physically present in the moment and with that movement, it works really well. So this particular scene, towards the end, when we talk about movement, well, he's actually in the scene a couple of times, but I do technically have a degree in animation. I'm not great at it. I try, but instead of just like slapping on like a wax cycle onto people, I try to make sure that the movements embodied the character themselves. So what I mean by that is like he's not just walking along, like he's walking sort of purposefully and sort of slumped, like kind of like he's been doing this every single night for a really long time, because there's no facial expressions, there's no facial animation. So just like with the journey, I want to make sure that the movement is actually portraying who the character is, so you can get a sense of who he is. And I mentioned that he doesn't interact with you. And I did this very specifically. I didn't want him to interact with you at all until the very end, because I wanted to see how quickly, really, I could have people make a connection with him. Because people tried. They would try. Like I think one guy tried tickling his beard or something for some unknown reason. I don't know why, but he doesn't do anything. But in the very end, he does interact with you. So, as I mentioned, this story is about a lonely lighthouse keeper who falls in love with Selkie. But it's a sad story. Selkie ultimately has to leave and go back to the sea because she's dying, right? And in the beginning of the story, you listen to the narrator talk about how, he is lonely, but he sort of is not really connecting with his feelings and he's sort of ignoring it. And then at the end, the narrator is telling you that, basically he's accepted his fate. He's accepted that, he had love, he's lost it, and he's accepted his loneliness like a friend, which is then when he interacts with you. So the user is sort of transparent through all of this. The user is meant to embody this feeling of loneliness, which is why you cannot interact with him, okay? Because you have no physical presence that you can actually do anything to him. But at the end, he acknowledges your existence, and it's about this acceptance, right? So he gestures for you to come and sit next to him. And something really cool happened at the end, because everybody, no matter what they were doing, so really it was mostly two reactions. They either pointed to themselves and looked around like is there somebody else, or they immediately got it and went and sat next to the person, which is exactly what I wanted, right? And so the connection was really, really instant of just having them acknowledging you, right? So they don't need to speak. There doesn't need to be dialogue. They don't need to have a task that they have to do. They don't need to have a goal to be involved, which is the entire embodiment of the storytelling that I'm trying to do. So my PhD is focused on creating this narrative engagement and keeping people there the entire time so that when they take that VR headset out, they're like, shit, I'm in the real world now. I want that every single time to happen, no matter your experience, right? It doesn't matter if you're a first-time user or you've been using VR a lot and you play a lot of games. And really, AONR did well because it does that for every single person, okay? And that's it. Yep. Short and sweet. Yep.
Do you find that going for a stylized presentation helps or hinders immersion?
You know, I don't know. Honestly, my general style is not this. I do very photorealistic stuff. Like I do like digital sculpting, and it is very realistic. This is actually very new to me, to doing something stylized. I think I only chose it because I was sort of going for like a storybook kind of feel, because it is focused on Scottish folklore, and so it is, you know, it's obviously something that's fantastical, and I kind of wanted that kind of feel to it. So that's really the only reason, but I haven't really, you know, the focus was on the story, not necessarily, you know, and how the artistic elements, really emphasize that. So I don't really think offhand that it would matter so much whether or not it was more photorealistic or not. But I don't know. That's not my research, so could be. Yep.
What part does sound take in this whole experience?
A very, very huge role. Very huge role. So VR, along with all of the functions that it does, utilizes spatial sound. So I most definitely utilize that. So especially because you're on this island with the ocean, and all of the sounds are spatialized. So when you move, sound changes as you get closer to the waves, changes when you pan your head side to side, just like it does in real life, which all helps create that presence. So the only thing that doesn't have spatialization is the narrator, which is just like a voice in the sky basically talking to you occasionally. But there's also music. So just like the journey, the music really drives a lot of the animation. So a lot of time spent trying to figure out how the music actually fits, what music I can actually use that I have copyright, but almost the same amount of time as actually designing it, to be honest.
Thank you. What a beautiful game. How is the connection between the user and the character when, since it's VR, you're picking things up and the character's using those things?
So they don't use them all the time. So the way that so this story doesn't have like a continuation like button or anything. It just goes from one scene to the next like a blackout. So basically, I just very strategically placed certain items that I want you to interact with, or that I'm hoping that you interact with, closer to the player during certain scene cuts. So like even like fades to black, like the item that he was holding earlier may not be next to you, sort of thing. So really a little bit more like film in that aspect, because I can't control what people do, right? I can only hope that they look where I want them to look and that they do touch what I want them to touch. So it's kind of a toss-up.
Yeah, I had a question around the objects themselves.
Yeah.
Like, did you, when you were playtesting, what did you find made something like a more fragile object as opposed to a turnip or a carrot?
That's a really interesting question, and the answer is nobody knows.
No.
So, no, seriously. So when I was doing research, it's unclear really, because everybody's different, what they're actually going to be driven towards. But the main thing is that there is curiosity. So as long as there is curiosity, and the curiosity has to be at a point where you know just enough, but not everything, that it keeps you there and that you want to learn more. And it depends. So one of the reasons why, so this is a linear story, right? So like you can't change anything, but every single person experiences the story different, because each scene is different towards them. So for instance, the garden scene that I showed you, like at the end of my study, I would ask people like what their scene was that they connected most to, right? Just kind of out of curiosity. And for instance, one particular person said the garden scene, and I asked him why, because I didn't really think anything special happened in that scene. And he said because he used to garden with his wife on the weekends, and they don't do that so much anymore. And it reminded him of it, and made him nostalgic. And so that's really just about creating such an environment that can give people, you know, that was not my intention, you know. But that's what I mean by everybody experiences the plot differently. You know, there's a scene where you're on top of the lighthouse and there's Northern Lights happening, you know, and some people felt really connected to that because they've never, you know, it's something that they always wanted to do, but they have never been able to do, you know, things like that. So nobody knows. But like I said, it's really about creating that curiosity. So they don't need to necessarily know why an item is important. They just need to know that it is important in some aspect. And because the reason why they're looking at it in such like a fragile way is they're trying to figure out why. And that's where you kind of want to be. Is there something? No? Okay.
I would say for the objects, just because I was part of the testing out of all the things.
Shh.
Part of it is when you see the same object, like you see him use that shell, and you're like, that's cool. And then you see the next scene, you're like, there it is. So you feel like this additional connection to the character and to the story, and now you want to like become a part of it. So then when you see these things over and over, you're like, and it's like this extra like sneaky sort of connection thing that.
That's my wife. She's a little biased. So. Yep.
This might be a bit of an off-topic question, but for the journey, you mentioned you found a way to make the player not feel nauseous while you were controlling the camera. How did you get that to work?
Cue my wife over there.
Yeah.
So
welcome.
basically, I use her as a guinea pig. So it really depends on each scene, but there's a point, like you got to just really play with the speed and the angle of turns that you make on what's going to make you feel nauseous.
Okay.
And so it's really just a lot of user testing at that point, but there's no, you know, math that can make that happen. I will say too, it sort of depends on the environment. Like I found that it works well when I'm doing something that is underwater because you sort of already expect that. I don't know how well it would work in other instances because I haven't really tried it so far in other ways, but because it does sort of create a floating thing. So like if you were closer to the ground, that might affect you a little bit differently.
Forgive the ignorance if you've already mentioned it, but what's the sort of average play time for it? Like how long does it take for somebody to complete it? Or
24 minutes.
About 24, strangely specific. Cool.
I mean, each scene has, you know, I mean, it is timed because like there is like music set to it, so I'm probably close to 24 minutes. I don't know. Could be 26. Depends on what hardware it's running. If it's running on this laptop, it might take a little bit longer than if it's running on a PC.
You mentioned the kind of shell and how people's behavior changed according to kind of handling something a bit more fragile. And I'm wondering, going back to your earlier work of kind of studying marine biology and all that, if there's a theme there, if that's something you're interested in terms of how VR can change behaviors?
Yes. So that's why I started with the journey because, like I said, I wasn't going to research it with it, but basically there was like a lot of questionnaires and stuff like changing actually how your mood changes from before and after each particular scene. So each scene I targeted a specific mood or emotion that I wanted the person to feel through the art and the music, etc. So that influenced what I did with AONR. So I took that and basically just took it farther, you know, based upon that initial thing because it does. It completely does. I mean, honestly, you could probably pretty heavily influence people if you wanted to, if you think about it, because it's really hard for us to see anything from any point of view unless we experience it. And VR lets you experience it. You know, like I never experienced being underwater before, and when I did that, I wanted to do it. I wanted to actually see what that was like for myself, you know, because it's not something I did. So, and that changed my behavior, right? So it can. It most definitely can change your behavior, and it is something that is part of my research very heavily. So there is a very strong psychological connection to a lot of it, but again, it gets really researchy. So. Yeah.
Did you ever experience any dissociations in players? That's all.
Give me an example.
So, like someone kind of reacted completely abstract
Yes.
to what you were intending.
Well, yes. So okay, so there's a bird in this, all right? It's like a hooded crow. And I didn't think of anything about it. Like, I actually used it as a way to sort of guide your view. So it appears several times, and then like it'll caw or whatever. And I didn't think about like, oh, somebody might be afraid of birds. So so I had like one of the very first scenes is you're on top of a lighthouse and this bird flies up to you and like sits beside you because you can like touch it and stuff, and because there's like haptic feedback. And she like freaked out, like backing away, like trying to get off of. You're on the ledge, right? She's trying to get off of the ledge of the lighthouse, like the bird's going to attack her. So yes, you can't really account for everything that's going to happen, though. I mean, I'm not going to stop making birds in my programs, but yes, it definitely can happen. Yeah.
And I would say the emotional response of the journey is like really intense because for Annar, there's a person there, right? So that's a different sort of connection. Whereas with the journey, you're watching this like little baby whale, and you see the mom get taken away, and now you're like completely invested and connected with this little whale, and you're following it.
Yeah, my goal is to make people cry. No, it's true. If you come out of the experience and you cry, I've won. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it makes you think about these characters or these things in different ways. Like I would never think I have a deep emotional attachment to a whale and I'm gonna cry because it's a whale. But I did, and but then with the back to the objects and everything, it gives you an opportunity to like with the fragile objects, right? You're at this point where there's like a bunch of sea turtles everywhere, and you get to reach out and be like, hello turtle. But like you feel like some trepidation, you're like, that's a wild animal, oh he's like right there. So it's like, and then you have this emotion, that is so cool. But yeah, it's weird when you have the emotions with it. You're like, that's weird.
Would you like to finish my talk? My wife will be taking your questions now. Did you have a question? No? Okay.
No.
Anybody else? You good? Nope, yep.
Have you play tested non-VR players as well, or have you only had
Yes.
people playing it in VR? Okay. How did you find the difference?
Generally, it's more intense. Like, so I had one particular person that had never experienced it before, and she did cry quite a bit afterwards. I didn't think it was emotional enough to really invoke crying, but it's it's just like that same first experience for me. It is very because our reality is based purely upon what our senses give us. So it can affect people really strongly. I mean, you can definitely tell the people that are a little bit more experienced, like how they move around. But ultimately, as long as they feel what it is that I'm trying to make them feel, it doesn't. I do tend to target people that are a little bit less experienced because I do want to sort of make sure that it is usable to people that know nothing about things. Like I said, like we were talking earlier about the difficulty of getting into things. It is, you've got all these wires, you've got all these buttons and stuff, and it does become complicated to people, and then they don't know what to do and they start to freeze. So I try to simplify it, which may make people that are used to doing a little bit more, a little irritated, but I really don't care, because that's not really the point, so, yeah.
Right. Oh, one more question.
I was going to say, with the experiences that you're building, which are obviously very immersive, and you're trying to create these emotional experiences for people, are you including any kind of content warnings about, by the way, there's birds in this? To sort of. So
on a PhD, there are ethics. Yes, I do have to sit down with people beforehand and go over like a little rehearsed thing about things. And then we have to have it like a debrief. Yeah, we have to have like a debrief afterwards about what they experienced. So it is a very, it's a whole don't worry. I'm not just throwing people in there and being like, good luck. No, there's actually a very certain pattern that I have to follow when I'm testing them, just to make sure that they don't walk away traumatized. But it's not really that traumatizing. No, I don't think. No.
No more questions? Oh,
Sorry, actually, is it playable? Like, can we download it? Is there a link? Or?
I have it here. Not yet. I'm working on it, but I'm a student. I have no money. So we're supposed to get a grant to put it online, and which at that point it'll be on like Steam and Oculus, and it'll be free to download. It's not going to be a paid anything. So, but this is, like I said, this is my pilot. I just finished my final project, which is like a sister story to this one, which honestly I think is way better. But really I want to package them together because they sort of, there are like some sort of things that connect, that it's the same like sort of style. It's still about Scottish folklore. So it will be available, don't know when, but it is here if you guys want to take a look at it.
I think we've got about 24 minutes before.
I mean, you won't be able to go through the whole thing, but you can like see like the beginning or something. Yeah.
All right, well, thanks very much to Austin.